Running parallel to the God question is the anti-theism question. It is whether we as individuals or we as a species would be better off living in a God-governed universe or a godless one. Voltaire famously wrote that if God did not exist, it would be necessary to invent him. Bakunin considered the idea of God as a serious threat to human liberty, claiming that, quote, as long as we have a master in heaven, we will continue to be slaves on earth. He therefore reversed Voltaire's famous aphorism, claiming that if God really existed, it would be necessary to abolish him. Is this a worthy line of inquiry or debate, even if we assume, for argument's sake, that atheism is true? This question of whether we'd be better off in a God-governed or godless universe?
I don't know that there's a whole lot to gain by thinking about that. I mean, it is relevant to certain questions, especially relating to the problem of evil. Why is there so much evil and suffering in the world if it's governed by an omniscient, omnipotent, and omnibenevolent God? I personally think that that's a very profound problem for theism. And if you really believed that, then it's hard not to, if you really believe that the universe was so governed, it's hard not to think that that would just be better, almost by definition, but even just sort of intuitively and from a logical point of view about the sort of outcome that we would expect to achieve if there was such a capable and benevolent being who was governing everything. So in that sense, it seems like it would be a better place. That being said, I also think that the particular vision of the cosmos that has been developed and defended by, well, at least certain monotheistic religious traditions, I find very unattractive. The idea of an eternal hell where people are tormented, for example, for disobeying God, and where God seemingly requires us to engage in total submission to his demands and things like that. I find that all very unattractive. So in that sense, maybe we are better off without a God. But I mean, it's very difficult in these debates because people will then say, well, whatever God wants or commands us is by definition good. And so we might not like it, but it still is better for us in that cosmic framework, right? So it's, I think, rather difficult to adjudicate those sorts of claims. But at the same level, I think that we should be interested in the way reality is and not how we might hope it to be, with the caveat that we should strive to improve it, right? But for issues where we have no control, such as whether God exists, well, it is what it is.
Yeah, so a general problem with the use of evidence and logic as opposed to the use of reasonable speculation, imagination, rationality more broadly defined is this question of time constraints. We live in a time of unprecedented change. And so this question, the AQ, the anti-theism question, becomes interesting when we think about artificial general intelligence. Is godhood or God making a useful analogy for artificial general intelligence? And if so, is godhood, making a God, something to be pursued or something to be avoided? Do we want to become gods? Do we want to create a God? Is there a risk of creating a God?
People do use this language quite a lot, especially in the context of new technology, about playing God with so-and-so, by which they seem to simply mean exercising control over something. And I think that that's interesting, that a lot of people seem to associate control, particularly over things that seem like we traditionally have not had control over, perhaps the weather or biology or, I don't know, travel, very fast travel, or all sorts of other things that people might think of as things that humans were not supposed to know or not supposed to be able to do. Now, I guess I don't really share that sort of sense of there being any intrinsic boundary to what it is and is not appropriate for humans to do. I think it's really a question about what we can do and then what the consequences of exercising certain capabilities would be. So in that sense, should we strive to become God? I think there's a sense in which we should, maybe not literally, but in the sense of striving to achieve greater mastery over our environment and mastery over our own destiny, which presumably God has. I think we should strive to do that, not in a purely self-interested point of view, but more in terms of the human species. We should be trying to better the world. We should have a sense of
that's striving for
agency.
Autonomy and agency.
Well, but that's an important aspect of the nature of God, is that he is an agent who has ultimate not autonomy and authority. Now, maybe we shouldn't be striving for to subject all of nature to our mastery, and arguably the way that God does. But so I suppose it depends on exactly what you think it would mean for us to strive to be gods. But in some senses, I think that we can say we should do that, striving for more autonomy and ability to overcome difficulties in our path.
So you think that there is some utility of the metaphor of God, or of the ideas of God, as an analogy for AGI or for a transhuman or post-human potential subject, at least as God and gods have been defined in the past as being, without limitations or having greater knowledge or greater compassion, etc.
There's a place for that sort of language. I mean, I would be quite reticent to use it myself, depends on the context. But, there's certain aphorisms that lend themselves to this sort of thought. Like, I think, was it Arthur C. Clarke who said that any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic? And I guess I would add to that, indistinguishable from a divine miracle as well. And there's ways we can think about technology where, in some sense, we are like, if you think about human capabilities and powers as being extended, so not just purely limited to our body, but extended to the devices and social institutions we can call upon to find answers to things or achieve things, then we have dramatically expanded human powers over the past centuries and millennia, and become near demigods by contrast to what people were 5,000 years ago, and what they would have understood if we were to go back and interact with them. And so I think that thinking about that in a mythological context or a science fiction context can help us to conceptualize both and really understand how far we've come and how far there is still to go. I've actually pointed this out in religious contexts as well, where people make arguments about miracles or prophecies and things like this. And I sort of point out that, well, look, maybe God is intervening in the course of human affairs, and maybe this tells us something, but how can you rule out the idea that there aren't very capable beings, like aliens or something, or artificial intelligences created by who knows what that have traveled to our planet, that aren't intervening in the course of human affairs for whatever purposes? Right now, I don't want to say that I believe that that's happening, but the point is, how would we distinguish those two cases? How do you distinguish between a very technologically sophisticated civilization or entity and an actual sort of God or supernatural being or entity? I think that it's, in many cases, incredibly difficult, and those begin to look very similar to each other. So I think that there is some use here in certain cases of that sort of language, but I want to be careful about what people aren't getting misconceptions about that, because I think that could go too far.
There are clearly dangers as well, of course.
Well, any new technology has dangers.
No, but I mean the danger specifically of the metaphor.
Yes,
the metaphor. To find AGI as a god or the devil or the Antichrist, you get into very fishy waters.